Billy Corgan claims that Metallica ripped off the Smashing Pumpkins. We may know who's playing Paul McCartney in the upcoming Beatles biopic movie. The surviving Soundgarden members get together for a charity gig. And the biggest album of the year shows the sad state of the world of rock music in 2024. It's all coming up on this edition of the Rock News Roundup podcast. Everyone, and welcome to the Rock News Roundup podcast, your destination for the latest in rock music news, reviews, and discussion here on the Nick Chino Music YouTube channel and across streaming platforms. I'm your host, Nick Chino. Welcome to the show, to the second episode of the Rock News Roundup podcast. This podcast still very much in its infancy, but I want to thank you for joining me to talk about some of the biggest topics, the biggest headlines in the world of rock music over the last week or so. This podcast is available on my YouTube channel at Nick Chino Music if you want to watch the video version, but also available as an audio-only podcast across streaming platforms, whether it be Spotify or Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. You can listen to that on an audio-only version. And if you do listen to it on an audio-only stream, we'd appreciate if you give us a rating and review and let us know how we're doing here on the show. Again, still in its infancy, so I appreciate everybody for listening to the show. And we're gonna run down some of the biggest headliner topics in the world of rock music this week, including talking about the biggest selling rock album of 2024. And it's not even an album that was released in the last decade or 2 decades or 3 decades. And I'm going to tell you why I think that's a very, very depressing proposition. The Soundgarden members, the surviving members of Soundgarden, reunited for a charity show last weekend. We're also going to talk about Billy Corgan accusing, or really just addressing that James Hetfield, Metallica, might have ripped off a Smashing Pumpkins song for the Metallica hit Fuel. But we're going to kick off the Rock News Roundup podcast with the first topic this week, and that is that actor Paul Mescal might be playing Paul McCartney in the new Beatles biopic movie, or the series of Beatles biopic movies that are going to be coming from director Sam Mendes. And this is coming from a bunch of different sources. It's originally coming from The Hollywood Reporter, that is reporting that director Ridley Scott said that Gladiator II, his star from that movie, Paul Mescal, who's an up-and-coming actor. I haven't really seen him in too much, but he's in that new movie, Gladiator II. He's kind of the Russell Crowe of that movie. They're saying that he's lined up to play Paul McCartney in the upcoming Beatles biopic movies, or series of movies, like I said, from director Sam Mendes. This was actually announced earlier this year that they're going to be making these series of Beatles movies, 4 individual Beatles movies that are going to cover the Beatles' careers, their individual stories, and then lead them up into essentially a team-up movie that's going to be, I don't know, like the Beatles Endgame or something like that. It's kind of like an Avengers-style team-up. So Ridley Scott says that he heard that Paul Mescal is pretty much lined up to do the Beatles movies as his next project. Again, kind of an indirect source coming from Ridley Scott, who's not really directly involved with this Beatles biopic movies or series of movies, but somebody who might be a little bit more in the loop is Ringo Starr, the Beatles drummer, who said that Barry Keoghan, who's been a bunch of different things all over the place, would be playing Ringo Starr in the Beatles movies, which makes sense because definitely Barry Keoghan has a little bit of that Ringo Starr look to him. And I think that Paul Mescal can pull off Paul McCartney. I don't really think for these biopic movies that the look of the character has to be exactly like the person in real life. I feel like that would be kind of difficult, even though they've done it for plenty of biopic movies in the past. So like I said, it's these individual movies that are leading up into this thing called, whatever, like I said, the Beatles Endgame or the Beatles Infinity War, whatever you want to call it. But this is a little bit of a weird topic for me. Like, where do I even start? I have to say, hate is a strong word, but I very much dislike biopics about musicians. Don't get me wrong. I do enjoy them about other types of famous people, whether that be actors or people who are famous for other various things. But I absolutely hate, I'm just going to go out and say it. I hate movies about musicians because I always feel them to be very cliche. They always tend to follow the same rock and roll movie tropes that most movies tend to follow. And you know what? I think about some of the more recent biopic movies that have been released about musicians. We had Bohemian Rhapsody, which I have not seen. That movie looked atrocious. Rocket Man, the Elton John biopic movie. Back to Black, the Amy Winehouse biopic movie that came out earlier this year, which looked absolutely horrible. That was not a good idea at all. And then there's another one coming out this month. I think it might already be in theaters or coming out in wide theaters very, very soon. And that's the movie A Complete Unknown, which is the Bob Dylan movie starring Timothée Chalamet. So I don't think I'm really that interested in biopic movies, whether it be any of those ones, although there are some ones in the past that have been released, and maybe it's because there are maybe more low profile characters that are featured in that. And that would be Backbeat, which was a 1994 movie, which came out with Stephen Dorff, which he starred as Stuart Sutcliffe, which was kind of an exception because Stuart Sutcliffe was a member of the Beatles who died very young, was not there when the Beatles made it famous. And that's a story that we don't really know as well. We know the Beatles story. If you're a fan of the Beatles, you know the ins and outs of the Beatles story very, very well. You know, I've been reading or rereading Tune In all these years, which is the first Beatles volume from Mark Lewison, which covers kind of the Beatles' career leading up to 1962 when they first signed the record deal and they're on the cusp of becoming the biggest thing ever. That was a great book by Mark Lewison. And we know all the facets of that story. And then I really loved Weird, which was the Weird Al Yankovic movie starring Daniel Radcliffe. And that was really because they took the piss out of the Weird Al story, right? So there wasn't really, it wasn't really taking itself too seriously, which a lot of these musician biopics tend to do. And with that Stuart Sutcliffe movie, it was like an exception because it was covering a lesser known member of the Beatles who passed away very, very young, had a great soundtrack, which featured Dave Grohl on drums on that one. So there always, there have been some good biopic movies made about musicians in the past, but then they always tend to, like I said, distill those moments into a few very cliche moments. I can just picture a scene in the Beatles movie when they eventually do team up for the Avenger Beatles or whatever they're going to call it. The band's going to be working in the studio. They're going to be at Abbey Road. They're going to be working on a song. It's going to be a long day. And then Ringo says, you know, as I'm sure he said in real life, because this is a total Ringoism, he's like, oh, it's been a hard day's night, eh, fellas? And then, you know, John and Paul Mescal as Paul McCartney and whoever's going to play John Lennon sit up and be like, Ringo, what did you say? What was that? Oh, it was a hard day's night. And then bang, they write the song there in the studio. Of course, they have to have the obligatory scene where they're singing at the mic with their hands on their headphones, you know, like it's been it's just going to be cheesy. I tend to think that a lot of these biopic movies distill these really complicated moments. It's not to say I've been in a band at the level of the Beatles, but I've been in a band and it's very creative and you're spending long hours in the studio trying to make things sound right. It's not necessarily always the most glamorous process, even though the result is an amazing product, this amazing music that the Beatles gave us. But when you try to put that into into a biopic movie, sometimes it's a little bit hard to swallow. But then give me a music documentary any day. If you really want the definitive story of the Beatles, then I think you should probably go watch the Beatles anthology, which is not really readily available on streaming. It's one of those things that you might have to find in a discount bin at a DVD store or something like that. But the Beatles anthology really covers the entire Beatles story with interviews and stuff from the band, with the actual music, with the footage, which would be a lot better, infinitely better than watching some sort of biopic movie. And then you had the Beatles 64 movie, which dropped on Disney Plus over the last couple of weeks, which is another documentary about when the band first hit America in 1964. So there are better sources for Beatles content, for the story of the Beatles, other than these biopic movies. Again, I haven't seen them. I don't know if they're going to be good or bad, but I love the Beatles, but I hate biopic movies. So I'm very torn about this, although I think, not that I have a good sample size of his work, Paul Mescal, I'm sure would make a great Paul McCartney, Barry Keoghan as Ringo Starr, whoever they get to play John Lennon, whoever they get to play George Harrison. I'm sure they'll do a good job, but very torn about that. And we'll see if Paul Mescal can pull off playing Paul McCartney in the eventual Beatles biopic movies, which I don't think are due out for a while. I think 2027, I think is the release date. So we don't have to hold our breath on that one. So let's get to our next headliner topic on this edition of Rock News Roundup, and that is that Billy Corgan is calling out James Hetfield. Calling out might be a strong word, was calling out James Hetfield of Metallica for potentially ripping off a Smashing Pumpkins song. I don't really see the correlation here, but Consequence of Sound is reporting that Billy Corgan recently did an interview on the Ever Black podcast, which I haven't heard, but I've heard it's really good, where he calls out, or at least addresses, that Metallica's hit song Fuel from 1997's Reload rips off the riff, or takes a cue from the riff of the Smashing Pumpkins song Tales of a Scorched Earth, which was on disc 2 of Melancholy and the Infinite Sadness back in 1995. And talk about a deep cut. You know, I can see somebody saying, with Billy Corgan saying, oh, they ripped off Zero, they ripped off Bullet with Butterfly Wings. But now you're digging deep into disc 2 of Melancholy and Infinite Sadness when you get to Tales of a Scorched Earth. That is a deep cut on that record. It's definitely one of the heaviest and most aggressive songs on that record. It's got a really ferocious, just screamy vocal for Billy Corgan. He's really spitting some venom on that song. And obviously Fuel is a huge radio hit. It's not buried on any Metallica album. That was a huge song on the radio. You can still hear Fuel if you listen to any hard rock stations, FM rock stations. Fuel is always going to be on there. So Billy says this was more of a coincidence that Fuel might sound like Tales of a Scorched Earth, but he does say that Tales came first because that came on Melancholy in 95. We didn't get Fuel until Reload came out in 1997. And he also said that, he's not mad at James Hetfield for anything. He says that James Hetfield is one of the best riff writers of all time, probably only second to Tony Iommi, who was obviously the riff writer and the guitar master of Black Sabbath. So he's giving James Hetfield his props, and he said that he, as a songwriter, Billy Corgan, has probably ripped off some Metallica in his lifetime as well. So I went back and I listened to these two songs before I did this podcast, Fuel and Tales of a Scorched Earth. And I'm thinking, like, what exactly, if it is the riff that I'm thinking of, which is basically the opening riff of the song, like, what exactly is Billy Corgan talking about when he's ripping off this song? And again, there are so many different riffs in both songs. Tales of a Scorched Earth is a little bit of a journey. Fuel by Metallica has a lot of really great riffs in it, I think, beyond that opening riff. But if it's the one I'm thinking about, it's just kind of like a standard rock pull-off riff, like pull-off hammer-on riff, like I have my guitar here. I don't know if it's in the same tuning. I think Fuel by Metallica is definitely like a half step down, or maybe even further down than that. But I wanted to pull out my guitar here for a second and just see, basically it's like this. It's like, it could be in a different tuning, but both these songs basically have this. Which is pretty much an absolute standard rock riff. I think you'd be hard-pressed to find any guitarist worth their salt out there who wouldn't pick up a guitar and at least try to do a little pull-off like that, especially from that. I think it's around the same position. Again, I'm not totally right. I was just kind of messing around for the purposes of this podcast. But when you're pulling off from the 3rd fret there, like I'm in standard right now, you're pulling off from that G to the E. That is in every metal song. That's in a lot of hard rock songs, a lot of songs in general, That is in a lot of different songs. So I don't really think Billy Corgan has much of an argument to say that James Hetfield directly or indirectly ripped off the Smashing Pumpkins when it came to their song Fuel, because that is just a go-to guitarist riff, whether it be metal or hard rock or any genre that you're in. Everybody loves doing a good pull-off from a G to an E, or whether you're in drop D or something. And then, when you start getting up here, everybody loves Okay, I'm just going to stop now while I'm ahead, but basically you get what I'm saying. And so this is kind of an interesting story when you think about Billy Corgan saying that James Hetfield ripped off Fuel from Tales of a Scorched Earth. Again, if you're going to say, like, he ripped off Zero, or he ripped off Bullet with Butterfly Wings, or he ripped off 1979, and it was this blatant riff, then yes, but you can't say that James Hetfield was, I'm sure he's a Smashing Pumpkins fan, like we all are, but he was going deep into disc 2 of Melancholy. What was he going to say next? He ripped off XYU from Melancholy. He ripped off We Only Come Out at Night, and he ripped off Bodies, which, all great songs from Melancholy and Infinite Sadness. Don't get me wrong, but, seems like a little bit of a stretch to me. But Billy Corgan has always been a little bit weird in those interviews. But either way, both of those songs, whether it be Fuel or Tales of a Scorched Earth, both fabulous hard rock songs. Fuel being that huge radio hit that still gets played on the radio probably every 2 hours nowadays, as it did back in the day. And then Tales of a Scorched Earth, which I don't think has ever been played on the radio. It absolutely should. I should have spun that when I was still on FM radio. That would have been a real kick to say, you know what, we're going to skip Bullet with Butterfly Wings today. We're going to skip Today. We're going to skip Cherub Rock. And we're going to do Tales of a Scorched Earth. Now that probably would have gotten me kicked off the air. But anyway, let me know in the thoughts, or your thoughts in the comments below, what you think of this with Billy Corgan saying that Metallica ripped off the Smashing Pumpkins. I think it's a little bit of a stretch. I think that riff is a pretty common riff that most guitarists would probably play, especially if you're in metal or if you're in hard rock and doing those fast pull-off riffs and those fast hammer-on riffs. Those are just fun-ass to play. Those are fun-ass riffs to play. I think that's just something that all guitarists would go for. But if you're a guitarist and musician, you can let me know in the comments below. And let's get to the next topic on the Rock News Roundup podcast, and that the surviving members of Soundgarden have reunited for charity. On December the 14th, this past weekend, the surviving members of the band, this is coming from spin.com, reunited at a fundraiser for Seattle Children's Hospital. Kim Thiel, Ben Shepherd, and Matt Cameron, using the name New Dragons, which was the name that they used as a reunited unit when the band got back together in 2012, when the late, great Chris Cornell was still with us. And like, talk about, you know, playing deep cuts. They're kind of similar to Smashing Pumpkins, going deep into Melancholy. Disc 2. The members of Soundgarden played some deep cuts on Sunday or on the weekend. They didn't really get into any of the big famous songs like Black Hole Sun or anything like that. They got into some more deep cuts with a Seattle vocalist named Shayna Shepherd. She was the one who sang the majority of the set in place of the late, great Chris Cornell, and they played a set of deep cut Soundgarden songs. Outshined was one of them. That was a bigger Soundgarden hit. But then they played Hunted Down, Flower, and Beyond the Wheel. There are some footage of this show that's circulating on social media if you want to check it out. And then Duff McKagan, the bass player for Guns N' Roses, also sang a couple of songs during the set. And I was thinking, this is actually very, very cool because they got together for not necessarily the biggest high profile gig. This wasn't necessarily something that was billed as like a Soundgarden reunion, which was something that obviously, you know, is not really going to happen without the late Chris Cornell. So nothing really high profile, just a local show to benefit a local charity in Seattle, which is never a bad thing. A very, very cool thing for them to do. And it's been a little bit of a whirlwind for Soundgarden and their camp over the last few years since the death of Chris Cornell in 2017. They were involved with a legal battle with Chris Cornell's wife, Vicky Cornell, over unreleased music that they had recorded with Chris Cornell. And I think the last time I checked, they did come to terms in 2023 to eventually release what they're calling the final Soundgarden album. And there is another Soundgarden album on the way. So we know that it's in the works. I don't really know. There might be some more legal issues involved with that. But when they put out their last album, their reunion album in 2012, King Animal, that album was absolutely incredible. One of the absolute best Soundgarden albums. They'd been out of the game since 1997 with Down on the Upside, and then they got back together on King Animal and released an absolute, you know, fair to say it, a beast of a record. King Animal really was front to back such a great Soundgarden album. I think one of the best Soundgarden albums. And then in 2017, we lost Chris Cornell. Still one of the biggest losses in all of rock music. I still think that, you know, as a genre, as just basically as a planet, we're still feeling the loss of Chris Cornell because he was such a singular voice and a singular songwriter and really just one of a kind. And really that voice, absolutely incredible, that voice of Chris Cornell. And so, you know, the band they've never replaced him, and rightfully so, because I think Chris Cornell is really hard to replace. I think, you know, fans were already up in arms about Linkin Park, not necessarily replacing Chester Bennington, but bringing in another co-vocalist, continuing on as Linkin Park. That was a very, very controversial decision. And I think, you know, imagine the uproar if it was a Soundgarden, if Soundgarden, those three guys went out and got another singer for real, not just somebody guesting at a local charity show. If they went out and got another singer for real, the type of uproar that would happen from that would be absolutely insane. And I do think it depends on the dynamic of a given band. You know, when you think about Linkin Park, they got a new singer in there. Not that you could really replace Chester Bennington, but there was enough going on with the other members that to bring somebody in allowed them to continue on. And that's how it goes with other bands too. STP, Stone Temple Pilots, when they brought in first Chester Bennington and then Jeff Gutt as their singer for STP. Something different about the dynamic of that band, whether it be because the DeLeo brothers write more of the material, or I don't really know the inner dynamics of all these different bands, but there's something about the dynamics of those bands that allow them to carry on, continuing with their name. But I think with Soundgarden in particular, that would be a band that would find it very hard to continue on without Chris Cornell, or to continue calling themselves Soundgarden with a new lead singer. So I think to get this final album will be very cool. It's nice to see that they're keeping busy. I know Matt Cameron and Kim Thayil also have another project with Chris Novoselic from Nirvana. So there's a lot going on there, but very cool to see them getting together. And again, nothing high profile, just getting together for a good cause. It's the holidays, to get together for a charity show for a local hospital. Really, there's no better reason to get back together and do a reunion with Soundgarden and play some deep cut Soundgarden songs. They didn't really go down the route of playing their big radio hits, which is understandable. Again, there is some footage online of Shayna Shepherd and Duff McKagan singing some of the songs. So very, very cool. If you want to check that out, that's online. And hopefully we will, fingers crossed, at some point in the next couple of years, pending on all those legal battles are figured out between Vicky Cornell and Soundgarden, get that final Soundgarden album with Chris Cornell, because I think that'll be absolutely incredible. King Animal, the last record, was phenomenal, and hopefully the new record will be as well whenever we do hear that come out. So let's get to the final topic on this edition of the Rock News Roundup podcast, and that is that 2024's biggest selling rock album. Okay, so this comes from Ultimate Classic Rock, who's reporting that the biggest rock album of 2024 is Fleetwood Mac's Rumors. The biggest rock album of 2024 is a 47-year-old album. Fleetwood Mac's Rumors was the highest charting rock album on Billboard's year-end chart, coming in at number 34. And when looking at the top 200 albums that made this list, 29 of the top 200 were from rock artists, all but 5 of these releases, all but 5 of the rock artist releases. So out of that 29 were greatest hits compilations, including greatest hits compilations from Foo Fighters, Linkin Park, Aerosmith, Beatles, Blink-182, and more. And then in terms of original albums that weren't compilations, no surprise there, some of the biggest rock albums of 2024 were Nirvana's Nevermind, AC/DC's Back in Black, Linkin Park's Hybrid Theory, and then Sublime's self-titled record from 1996. And okay, this has always been a really tough topic for me to talk about in any capacity, because I love these albums. Okay, these are some of the greatest albums of all time, some of the greatest bands of all time. But I do think that this is kind of showing the sad state of the rock music world in 2024. Okay, I love Rumors. I love Fleetwood Mac. I love Rumors. I have my own copy of Rumors. In fact, I think I have 2 copies of Rumors. Okay, every rock fan has a copy of Rumors. Okay, it's like Mike Myers said in the first Wayne's World with Peter Frampton's Frampton Comes Alive. If you lived in the suburbs, you were issued it. Okay, it came in the mail with samples of Tide. Okay, so everybody's got a copy of Rumors. Okay, I understand that it's one of the best albums of all time. Fleetwood Mac, one of the best bands of all time, along with all these other bands that are on this list. But it's just so depressing that when you have, the top rock albums of 2024, it's albums that are 47 years old or bands that are 30 years old, and that there's no new bands and no new music that can penetrate those year-end lists when it comes to sales, when it comes to influence, when it comes to cultural impact or anything like that. And like with the plethora of new bands out there, it's just really weird that there's nobody really making an impact on the level of these classic artists. I'm not really sure if it's the same across all genres. I think maybe in the pop music world, a lot of more current artists are the ones selling records, whether that be the big ones like Taylor Swift or Sabrina Carpenter or Chappell Roan or any of those, even newer artists. I feel like for pop artists, they continue to dominate those charts. But then something with rock is just not computing. And the thing is that as a musician, as a rock music fan, I absolutely hate it when people are saying, oh, there's no good rock bands anymore. There's no good bands anymore. There's no good write anything anymore. That is absolute bullshit, because there are more bands, like bands of all different sizes, all bands of all different kinds emerging now. There are more than ever. I listen to them all the time here on the channel for different reviews, for different things. I love new music. And don't get me wrong, I love my classic bands, right? Like you see Oasis, the Beatles. I have them all up here on my wall. I have my Foo Fighters t-shirt on here right now, but I still love the discovery of new music. Even, a band like Don Broco, who are a band over they're not even new anymore. They're on their 4th record, but I love new music. I love up and coming rock bands, and I always crave new music. I still listen to the classics, Oasis, Foo Fighters, Beatles. This stuff is always going to be in my rotation, but I love adding to that new music, the discovery of new music, whether it be listening to new music or writing new music. I always love the discovery of new bands. There are so many bands out there that are doing great things. You just go on Spotify, you'll have no problem finding them, whether it be all the different genres too. Like if you're a classic rock fan, there are newer bands out there, bands like Greta Van Fleet, although I know they're a Led Zeppelin ripoff. Greta Van Fleet to Rival Sons if you're a classic rock fan. If you're more into alt rock, if you're more into metal, if you're more into all these different genres of rock, there are more bands out there making amazing music now than ever before. So I will always die on that hill that there's awesome new music being made at all times and are still being made in 2024. I look forward to discovering more new music in 2025. But the thing about it now is that the difference with these bands that are up and coming now, or the bands that have been around for the last little while, and bands that are obviously still selling more from past decades, is that music now is too segmented. These bands now, these bands from back in the day, whether it be older bands from the 60s and 70s, like the Beatles and AC/DC, Led Zeppelin, Black Sabbath, whatever you want to call it, and then, fast forward to the 90s, with Pearl Jam and Radiohead and Oasis and Foo Fighters and Soundgarden and all those bands, they became the next generation of those classic rock bands, and they will never die. They will always be amazing. But they were able to make their mark in a time where the music world was a lot more holistic and less segmented. You could put a song on the radio and it become a huge hit. And those are still the songs that dominate radio today. If you put on a rock radio station in 2024, now going into 2025, you'll hear Led Zeppelin, you'll hear Oasis, you'll hear Pearl Jam, you're going to hear those older bands sprinkled in with some new stuff. But it's nowhere near what it used to be. And although I love discovering new music, there's no possible way for these days for those bands to become as big as these bands that have made this biggest selling rock albums list on Billboard in 2024. So as much as it's the truth, and I understand where it's coming from, it's actually extremely disappointing, extremely depressing when this ends up being the case, because, I enjoy new music. I think, again, Rumors, all these albums, absolute classics, will always be classics. But maybe it's time for us to move on a little bit as music fans. And I think if you're a music fan or a rock fan who's out there saying there are no good bands out there's no new bands, that is absolute, that's absolutely false, because there are new bands playing in the bar around the corner from you. There are new bands on Spotify. There are new bands all over the internet. You just got to dig a little bit deeper to find them. Not even that deep. I think with Spotify, you get recommendations all the time for great rock music. So it's a sad state of affairs in 2024. In my opinion, that Fleetwood Mac, Rumors, again, classic album, love it, would be the biggest selling rock album of the year. I find that to be a little bit sad considering how much amazing new music is out there. But I guess that's just the state of affairs in 2024. But you can let me know in the comments what you think. Let me know on social media at Nick Chino Music whether you think it's kind of sad that Fleetwood Mac, a 47-year-old album, Rumors, is still the biggest selling rock album of 2024. I think it's kind of sad. As much as I love Fleetwood Mac and I love Rumors, I just wish that more people would just explore themselves, spread their wings, branch out a little bit and listen to more new music. But that is the last topic for this edition of the Rock News Roundup podcast. I want to thank you for watching, listening, wherever you are. If you want to chime in on the topics on this edition of the show, you can do so on YouTube at Nick Chino Music, and you can talk to me on social media, whether it be on X or Instagram, across platforms, at Nick Chino Music. And it's getting towards the end of 2024. Christmas is next week, and we have New Year's after that. So here on the channel, We got a lot of different things happening. I just uploaded a Brit Rock 2024 year in review, talking about some of the big Brit Rock releases of the year. Coming this weekend, we have another video, the Oasis 2024 year in review. It was a big year for us Oasis fans. And then over the next couple of weeks, maybe next week and the week after, my top 10 list of 2024, my top 10 rock albums of 2024, my top 10 rock tracks of 2024. So make sure that you keep your eyes peeled for those coming up on YouTube. And I'll see you guys again for another edition of the Rock News Roundup podcast. But until then, rock on, everybody.